That decision was made quietly, with both hands in her lap and a small smile that did not reach her eyes. No one at the table noticed. That was in the end the point. Vivienne had been 23 years old when she married Rupert Haldane. She had not loved him. She had not pretended to, not even on the morning of the wedding, when her mother had taken her hands and told her that love was something that came later, like furniture arriving after the house was already built. Vivienne had nodded. She had put on the dress. She had walked down the aisle of St. Edmund's with her chin level and her bouquet held steady, and she had thought, quite plainly, this is an arrangement, and arrangements can be managed. She was good at managing things. That was, in fact, the reason Rupert's mother had selected her. The Haldanes were a family of considerable standing in the county. Old money, old land, old expectations about how a house should run and how a wife should move through it. Vivienne's own family had the bloodline, but not the balance sheet. A situation that had become quietly critical in the years following her father's illness. The match made practical sense. Both sides understood this. No one said it aloud, which was perhaps the most Victorian thing about a marriage that technically took place in 1887. Rupert himself was not unkind. Vivienne would spend years turning that fact over, looking for comfort in it, finding less each time. He was not unkind. He was simply elsewhere. Even when he was in the room, he was elsewhere. He had a way of entering a space and immediately filling it with his own preoccupations. The grain yield, the new fencing along the north pasture, the correspondence he had not finished, the meeting in town he was already running through in his mind. He would sit across from Vivienne at dinner and eat his soup and not once look at her. Not because he disliked looking at her, but because it simply did not occur to him that there was anything there requiring his attention. He had a household. It functioned. That was what mattered. Vivienne ran that household with the precision of a woman who had been trained for exactly this and nothing else. She kept the account. She managed the staff, 6 indoor, 4 outdoor, and Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, who was technically senior to Vivienne in institutional knowledge, but who deferred to her, because Vivienne had quickly learned that deference, like almost everything else in the Haldane house, moved along predictable lines if you understood the map. She organized the dinners, wrote the invitations, received the guests, remembered everyone's preferences and ailments and family situations. She learned which tenants were struggling and discreetly ensured that certain rent arrangements were extended without fanfare, because she had understood within the first year that Rupert would not do this himself. Not out of cruelty but out of simple unawareness that it needed doing. She did all of this without being asked, without being thanked, without for a very long time even noticing that she was not being thanked, because she had been raised to understand that competence was its own quiet reward. It was only in the 3rd year that she began to feel something. A small tightening, low in the chest. The particular sensation of speaking and not being heard, not argued with, not dismissed, but simply not registered, the way a clock on a wall becomes invisible after you have lived with it long enough. She had tried, in the beginning, small things. She had asked, once, if Rupert would like to walk the grounds with her on Sunday afternoon, when the weather was fine. He had said perhaps, and then gone to his study. She had mentioned, over dinner, a book she was reading. Something about the natural history of coastal birds, which she had genuinely found fascinating. And he had nodded and said and then asked if Patterson had confirmed the delivery date on the new plow. She had suggested, in the autumn of their 2nd year, that they might attend the Hargreave concert together, since she had heard it would be very fine, and he had said he would try to be back from York in time, and he had not been. None of these were catastrophic. She understood that. She was not a woman given to catastrophizing. But they accumulated, the way dust accumulates in a room that is not properly aired, slowly, invisibly, until the day you run your finger across a surface and find that you cannot see the wood beneath. She stopped asking in the 4th year. She did not make a decision about it. She simply stopped, the way you stop expecting rain when the season changes. What she did instead was build, quietly, carefully, in the margins of the life she had been given. She discovered that Rupert's solicitor, Mr. Fenwick, was elderly and increasingly forgetful, and that many of the estate's legal documents were in a state of moderate disorder. She spent several months reading everything she could find on land law and tenant agreements, initially out of practical necessity, and then because she found, to her surprise, that she was quite good at it. She began corresponding with a woman in Edinburgh, a Mrs. Dunmore, a widow of independent means who ran a small lending concern for rural women. And through those letters, Vivienne learned things about money that no one had thought to teach her. She set aside a portion of the household allowance each quarter, Small amounts. Nothing that would be noticed. She told herself it was prudence. She was not yet ready to name what it actually was. In the 7th year of their marriage, Rupert's younger brother Owen came to stay for 2 weeks. Owen was a different creature entirely. Easier, warmer, the kind of man who actually looked at people when they spoke, who asked follow-up questions, who once spent an entire evening at the piano, playing hymns for Mrs. Poole because she had mentioned she missed hearing them. He was not a romantic prospect. Vivienne was clear-eyed enough to know that. But he was a reminder. A reminder that attention was a thing that existed in the world, that some men were capable of it, and that its absence in her own marriage was not a law of nature, but a choice. Passive and unconsidered, perhaps, but still a choice. After Owen left, Vivienne stood in the front hall for a long time, listening to the house settle around her. Then she went to her desk and wrote a letter to Mrs. Dunmore, asking a question she had never asked before. The answer came 3 weeks later, and it was the beginning of something she could not have named, but that she recognized. The way you recognize the particular quality of light in early April that tells you, before any leaf has opened, that winter is actually over. The dinner at which everything ended was, on its surface, an ordinary one. It was the 3rd Thursday of November, and Rupert had invited several county families. The Bracewell Hartleys, old Gerald Fenn and his second wife, a young couple named Dunwich who had recently taken the neighboring estate, and a visiting barrister from London named Collier, who was consulting on some matter of agricultural land rights. 8 at table, including Vivienne and Rupert. Vivienne had arranged everything. The menu had required 4 separate consultations with the cook, because the younger Mrs. Dunwich had a digestion that could not tolerate cream sauces, and old Mr. Fenn needed his meat well done. And Collier had mentioned in his correspondence that he kept to a plain table. She had ordered flowers. She had ensured the good china was brought out and inspected for chips. She had written place cards in her own hand. She had worn a dress of deep blue-green, the color of the sea in winter, which she had purchased the previous spring with money from her own account. The one that had no connection to the Aldane household books. The dinner was going well. The conversation moved easily enough, carried mostly by Rupert and Collier, who were deep in a discussion about a recent parliamentary bill. Vivienne spoke when spoken to, listened when she wasn't, and did the invisible work of keeping the table comfortable that no one ever noticed being done. It was during the fish course that it happened. Vivienne had said something. She would not later be able to recall exactly what, only that it was a response to a question Mrs. Dunwich had posed about land management, a question Vivienne was actually quite qualified to answer. She had spoken calmly and with some detail about the crop rotation practices she had suggested for the South Fields the previous spring, and the results that had followed. There was a brief silence. And then Rupert said, without looking up from his plate, "Yes, that's rather the approach I've been taking. Isn't that right, Helena?" Helena. He said it the way you say a name that is simply always there, automatic, unremarkable, already moving on to the next thought. And then he did look up, because he must have registered something in the silence that followed, some quality of stillness that demanded attention. The table had gone quiet. Not loudly quiet, quietly quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when 8 people simultaneously understand something and no one knows how to continue. Vivienne looked at her husband. His expression was uncertain now, slightly confused, not guilty, not horrified, just confused, the way a man looks when he has made an arithmetic error and cannot find where. Helena was his first wife, said old Mr. Fenn very softly, to no one in particular. Perhaps he hadn't intended to say it aloud. It was remarkable, Vivienne thought, how much information could be exchanged in a table's worth of silence. Every person there had put together what they needed to know. Every person there could see her, perhaps for the first time all evening. She reached for her wineglass, set it down. She picked up her fork, set that down too. Then she looked across the table at Rupert, at his uncertain face, at his hands that were now very still on the tablecloth. And she smiled. Not a cold smile, not a performing smile. A smile of genuine, private recognition, the kind that belongs entirely to yourself and costs you nothing to give. Then she folded her napkin beside her plate, excused herself in a voice that was entirely steady, and walked out of the dining room. She had not packed that evening. She had packed months ago. That was the thing no one would understand at first. Not Rupert, not Mrs. Poole, not even Owen, when he eventually learned of it. They would imagine it as an impulse, a breaking point, a woman undone by a moment of public humiliation who had acted without thinking. But Vivienne had thought about almost nothing else for 2 years. The trunk in the 3rd guest bedroom, the one no one ever used, had been assembled piece by piece across many months. Not dramatically, practically. A change of clothing, her correspondence with Mrs. Dunmore, organized in a leather folder, the documents Mr. Fenwick did not know she had copies of, the bank receipts, a small watercolor of the house she had grown up in, which she had removed from its frame and rolled carefully in brown paper, because it was the only thing she wanted that was truly hers. She had arranged for a cottage, a small one, rented through a name that was not her own. Mrs. Dunmore's name, actually, with that lady's full and enthusiastic cooperation. It was in a village 12 miles from the Aldane estate, which was both close enough for practical necessity and far enough to constitute a different world. She had engaged a solicitor in London whom Rupert had never met. She had done all of this carefully, over time, without drama, the same way she had managed the household accounts and the tenant correspondence and the seating arrangements for 8 years of dinners. Competently, quietly, with attention to detail. She left the house at 4:30 in the morning. The carriage she had arranged came to the back lane, not the front drive. She carried the trunk herself rather than wake anyone, which was not as difficult as it might have been. She was stronger than she appeared, from years of doing things herself. The house was dark and still. She did not cry. She had thought she might, standing in the front hall for a last moment, looking at the arrangement of rooms she had kept in order for 8 years. But she felt, instead, a peculiar clarity. The kind that comes when you have made a decision that was actually made long ago and are only now catching up to it. She left a letter on the desk in Rupert's study. It was not long. Rupert read it that morning, earlier than he might have, because Mrs. Poole had knocked on his study door just after 7 with an expression that caused him to put down his coffee. He read it, standing up. "You called me Helena," it began, not accusingly. "Simply stating a fact, the way you note the weather. I want you to understand that I am not leaving because of that. I am leaving because of the 8 years in which that name was never spoken, and in which I was nonetheless so invisible that when you finally did say a name, it was hers. I do not believe you are a cruel man. I believe you are a man who has never once had to notice something in order for it to happen. I handled many things in this house. I am leaving you with the knowledge of how they were done, because I wrote it all down. The accounts are current. The tenancies are in order. The contact for the Havelock matter is Mr. Selwyn in York, not Fenwick, who is no longer reliable. I am telling you this because I ran this house, and I am leaving you capable of running it without me, which is more than you would have done for me in the reverse situation. I am not signing this letter with any particular warmth, but I am also not signing it with bitterness. I am signing it with my name, which is Vivienne, and which I have now given you a full 8 years to learn." Rupert sat down. He read it again. He had the same experience that some men have when they are shown a picture of a thing they have been standing in front of without seeing. A sudden and vertiginous recognition that was almost indistinguishable from nausea. 8 years. He went back through them now the way you return to a text you misread and look for where the error crept in. He found it in too many places to count. She had asked him to walk the grounds with her, once. He had said perhaps. He had not gone. She had told him about the natural history of some birds. She had told him. He pressed his hand flat against the desk. He sat there for a long time. Owen arrived 4 days later, not at Rupert's invitation but at his own initiative, having received a letter from Vivienne that had crossed paths with the news from the estate. He came into the study and sat down without being offered a seat, which was the kind of thing Owen did. "You called her Helena," he said. "I know. Helena has been dead for 14 years. I know." Owen looked at his brother for a long moment. He was not an unkind man, but he was also not a comfortable one when the situation did not call for comfort. "She ran this house," he said. "She handled the Havelock matter when you were in Edinburgh. She renegotiated the Peel tenancy when old Peel died and his son wanted out. She kept Fenwick from making an absolute disaster of the Kramer Field agreement. Did you know any of that?" Rupert had not known any of it. He learned it now, over the following 2 weeks, in the process of trying to manage the estate without her. Not because he went looking, but because the absence of her management revealed, with startling clarity, the shape of everything she had done. It was like walking through a room you had never bothered to light, and finding, in the dark, the evidence of someone else's enormous labor. Furniture moved precisely, floors cleaned, every sharp edge padded so that you would never hurt yourself passing through. He began to write to her. The first letter was, he would not have admitted it aloud, a fairly poor performance. He said he had not known she was unhappy. He said he wished she had told him. He said he hoped she was comfortable and asked, almost in the same breath, whether she had the files relating to the Dunwich boundary line. He understood, when he reread it, that it was not a letter designed to reach her. He wrote another, then another. They improved, slowly, the way a man improves at something when he is forced to understand that improvement is required. In the fourth letter, he did not mention the estate at all. He wrote only about the morning he had walked the south fields and found the rotation she had suggested was holding exactly as she had said it would, and that he had stood there for a while, in the cold November light, trying to remember whether he had ever told her she was right. He had not. He knew that now with a precision that cost him something. "I am not writing to ask you to come back," he wrote in the fifth letter. "I am writing because I have begun to understand that I had a wife for 8 years and spent most of that time treating the evidence of her as incidental. I do not know what that understanding is worth to you at this point. I suspect it is not worth very much, and that is a fair assessment. But I wanted you to have it. My brother tells me you are well. I am glad. The birds you mentioned, in our 3rd year, I believe, I looked them up." Vivienne read that last sentence twice. She was sitting at a small table in the cottage's front room, a cup of tea going cold at her elbow, the November light coming through a window that was hers and no one else's. The cottage was very quiet. She had come to appreciate its particular quiet, which was different from the quiet of the Aldane house. That house's silence had been weighted with everything unsaid. This silence was merely silence. It had no pressure behind it. She set the letter down. She looked out the window for a while. She had built something here, in these several months. Something real, and modest, and entirely her own. Correspondence that she handled under her own name. A small arrangement with Mrs. Dunmore's lending concern. A routine that required no one's approval and accommodated no one's preferences but her own. She had discovered, a little to her own surprise, that she was not lonely. She had thought she might be, in the absence of the structure she had always occupied. But the structure had never, it turned out, been company. She thought about the south fields, and the rotation she had suggested, and the cold November light. She thought about 8 years. She picked up her pen. She did not go back to the estate. That was not something she was willing to negotiate, and she said so plainly in her reply. The first letter she had sent him, and not an especially warm one, though it was honest. She would not return to a structure in which she was invisible by default. She would not resume the management of a house whose owner had spent 8 years failing to notice she was managing it. What she proposed, instead, was something Rupert had not expected, and that took him several days to answer. She would, she wrote, consult. On the accounts, on the estate matters she had begun and left midway, not as his wife in residence, as herself, as Vivienne, who was competent and knew it, and had no intention of pretending otherwise. It was not modest. She also wrote that she was willing to have dinner, if he was willing to have dinner in the village, at a time of her choosing, with no expectation on either side, except that he would have to sit at a table and actually look at her. Not through her, at her. If you cannot manage that, she wrote, then there is nothing further to discuss. But if you find, upon reflection, that you can, then I would like to try that first, and see what it amounts to. Rupert wrote back in 24 hours. He said yes to the dinner. He agreed to the fee, which, he added, in a sentence that Vivienne read 3 times, was considerably less than she was worth, but he would not insult her by saying so, only mention it as a matter of record. She set the letter down. She did not smile immediately. She looked out the window for a while. She thought about the woman who had walked down the aisle of St. Edmund's at 23, chin level, holding her flowers, telling herself this was an arrangement that could be managed. That woman had not been wrong. She had only not yet known what it was she was actually managing toward. She picked up her pen again, and this time, without quite deciding to, she smiled. The same small private smile she had given at the dinner table, the one that belonged only to herself and cost nothing to give, the one that was, in the end, the beginning of every decision she had ever made clearly. She wrote the date and time for dinner. She sealed the letter. She walked to the village post office herself, in the cold air, and sent it, and when she came back, she put the kettle on, and sat down at her own small table, in her own quiet room, and waited for nothing but the water to boil.